Welcome to episode 94 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so all spelled out, SEVEN, health.com/94.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. Today it is another guest episode, and if you're a regular listener, you've probably noticed that it's been a little while since I've done a solo show. So I normally like to do one solo episode for every guest episode and just alternate week to week. But the last little while I've been struggling to find the time to put together the solo shows. So I recently just got back from a 10-day holiday in Italy. So I'm originally from Sydney, Australia, but I've now been living in the UK for the last 14 years. And each year my folks come over to visit and we go away somewhere. And this time they decided to do a 3-week trip traveling around Italy. So myself and Ali, my fiance, went to meet them, and we had 6 days on the Amalfi Coast. We stayed in a little village called Praiano, and it was just like heavenly. The food was phenomenal. I don't think we had a bad meal the whole time we were there, and we spent some of the time just relaxing by the pool, enjoying the sunshine, but we also did a bit of sightseeing. So went to Capri, we checked out the ruins at Herculaneum, which is a city similar to Pompeii that was wiped out after the eruption of Vesuvius back in 79 AD. And we actually climbed up Mount Vesuvius, and you got to see just amazing views of Italy and look inside the crater of a volcano. And then Ali and I had 3 days in Rome on our own. And Rome has to be one of my favorite cities. There's just so much history everywhere. You turn down some cobbled street and you're suddenly seeing the Pantheon or the Trevi Fountain, or in our case, you'd walk out of our apartment, you turn down a street and you just see the Colosseum right in front of you. So the food in Rome, just like in Praiano, was delicious, and I'm already missing the sunshine. It was like 20 to 30 degrees every day, which is glorious sunshine. So yeah, it was a really lovely holiday. But before going away, I still had a lot on. I'm actually working on something behind the scenes and have been doing it for quite a while. It's a food logging app that I've been developing with a past client for the last about 18 months, and it's called Tummy. We're at a stage where we want to have more people test it out, and so I'll be giving out more information about this in the next week or two, but it's just been taking up a lot more of my time. In addition to this, my fiance is actually pregnant, and we have a baby that is due in September. If you've been following my work for a while now, we've had some issues on the pregnancy front, and so this has been quite a while coming. So all the pregnancy-related stuff has been taking up some time, including us trying to buy a house. But there's no real complaints on this front with us, and we are very, very excited, but it's just been another demand on my time. So I have been feeling a little bit stretched of late, and I loved having some time off, which was definitely needed, but it's just meant for the last little while I haven't been able to put together a solo show. But I plan to be getting back into the groove of doing it, where I'm alternating between one guest show and one solo show. Although I think when the baby comes, I will probably have quite a run of just having guest shows for a little while, because the guest shows just take up considerably less time. But I will be back with another solo show next week. So with that little bit of update out of the way, let's get on with today's episode. And as I said, this is a guest episode, and my guest for this week is Charlotte Goodall. So Charlotte is a distance runner and coach. Originally from Ireland, she now lives in Oxford in the UK. She's been running competitively for 8 years, and in 2016 was the winner of the White Peak Race and the Ridgeway Run. She's also a keen road cyclist and a dressage rider, and her interests include sports nutrition, athletic performance, body image and exercise physiology, and specifically the psychology of exercise compulsion and overtraining. And she blogs at impossiblehighway.wordpress.com and is always keen to hear from other people who want to get help with finding a way to achieve performance goals without compromising their health or happiness. So this is actually the fourth podcasts that I've done on exercise in fairly quick succession. And I did my own podcast on exercise and fitness. I then had Tina Muir on chatting about giving up running due to hypothalamic amenorrhea, so her losing her period. I then had Pip Black on talking about Frame, so the company that she set up. And I'm now chatting with Charlotte. So I went 89 episodes without chatting about exercise, and now we're at episode 94, and we're up to 4 shows on the topic. And how I discovered Charlotte was she actually got in contact with me. So in an episode I did on energy flux, I mentioned that I wanted to do a show on exercise and also exercise addiction. And so Charlotte sent me an email and said that she has some personal experience with overtraining and exercise addiction or exercise compulsion. And I'm really glad that she did get in contact with me because I absolutely love this conversation. I've worked with so many clients that struggle with overtraining, even when it's clearly causing them issues. And Charlotte is very eloquent when talking about this. So we cover her background in sports and more recently as a runner. We talk about her issues around food and how this goes hand in hand with the exercise compulsion. And we chat about her struggles with exercise and with taking time off and giving her body the rest and the food that it needs. And while Charlotte was doing some pretty high mileage each week and training much more than most people, don't have this fool you into thinking that this is something that only affects people that are training like her. I've had lots of clients who are only training 3 or 4 days a week and were dealing with the same emotional issues around exercise that Charlotte expresses. So I don't think it is about the training volume per se, it's about people's relationship with exercise, and Charlotte is really good at explaining this. So with this incredibly long intro out of the way, let's get on with the episode. This is my conversation with Charlotte Goodall. Hey Charlotte, thanks so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast today.
Hi Chris, it's really nice to be here.
Awesome. So as part of the show today, we're going to be chatting about overtraining and exercise addiction or exercise compulsion. And I imagine we're going to cover a lot of ideas, but it'll all feed back into the broad category of taking exercise too far. So I guess the place I want to start is for you to give listeners a bit of background on yourself and how your personal experience has helped to inform you around these topics.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm 38 years old and I'm a runner, mainly a marathon runner and an ultra runner. And I've been running competitively now for, probably about 8 or 9 years. And I've been athletic for most of my life. But recently, the athleticism that had become a joy to me started to turn a little bit more negative. And my experience, I experienced some issues around my health, which I think came down to a compulsion towards exercise, which was making what had been a pleasure in my life turn into something that was a lot more negative and unpleasant. And I'm in the process of trying to work through that. And I've been finding a lot of resources online, including your podcasts, have been helping me hugely with working through my thoughts on this matter.
So I guess then, can you give a bit of background on like exercise as a kid and you growing up around doing sports or athletics? So how did that come to be and what did that look like when you were younger?
Sure. Well, I was always an athletic kid. I did sports my whole life, really. When I was a child at school, I ran on the track a lot, played hockey, I rode horses. I actually show jumped as a junior rider for my country. So sport was a big, big thing in my life. All the way through my childhood, I was one of those kids who was just always on the go, always running around, being quite active. And being active was something that even when I was very young was really important to me. And I remember this sort of feeling of needing to be out there all the time and needing to be doing stuff. And I think at the time, as a child in particular, that was quite a good thing because it meant that I was always enjoying myself and outside. And it led to a really interesting way of growing up around horses and climbing and walking. And I think in that sense, it was a really, really healthy thing. It wasn't overly competitive, even though I was quite good at what I did. But certainly when I was a child, that exercise side of things was always just a pleasure, and I really got pleasure out of moving my body. And that was a really important part of my life growing up.
And when did it then narrow more towards the running side of things and doing marathon running or ultra marathons, and those other things kind of dropped away a little more and that became more of your focus?
I think that a lot of that came with something that I think a lot of people can associate with. It was a breakup of a relationship. My marriage broke down, and at that point I hadn't been running at all, although I was still quite fit because I used to cycle and ride horses. And I was in the process of negotiating a divorce. And I remember I just put my running shoes on. They were really old. I took them out of the closet. I don't think I'd worn them since I'd been at school. I just put them on and I went for a run. And like most people, I went storming out of the house at 1,000,000 miles an hour, thinking I was Usain Bolt. And about 100 meters down the road, I just couldn't breathe and I had to walk. But something in it just clicked with me, and I realized that it gave me an outlet. It gave me an outlet for the emotions that I was feeling, and I started running on my own, and I just slowly built it up until very quickly, I think because I have a natural capacity for endurance and always have done, so very quickly I was easily running 10K and then a half marathon, and it all came very easily to me at that point, which I think is part of the problem.
Yeah, and so just so I have an idea of the time perspective, how old were you at that stage when you had that breakdown in your marriage and then you started getting back into running?
I was about 28, I think. Late 20s, certainly. And I should definitely point out that I was never unfit, and I was never somebody who hadn't done sports. I'd just fallen away from doing real competitive sport. So when I started running at that point, I was still quite a fit person. But if you looked at me, you wouldn't think I looked particularly athletic. And I certainly wasn't super fit in the way that you would think a runner would be. I was just a pretty ordinary person, not overweight, not super fit, not super athletic, who just decided one day, I think I'll go for a run.
Okay. And so then how did that trajectory ramp up to you doing more and more and doing at whatever level of competition you were doing it at?
Well, it's quite interesting because it ramped up relatively quickly, and I found myself being quite successful at a club level initially, where I was always sort of being placed in my age group at our local races. And then I moved onto the trail and started doing a lot of trail running, which is where my talents lay, and I started winning races. And winning races is quite addictive because then you think, I like this feeling, I like the adulation, I like the admiration I'm getting because I won this race. And so that makes you then push yourself more and push yourself more. And then I ran a very good time at the London Marathon last year, a time which qualified me for the championship, which is the English Marathon Championships, where you get to start directly behind the elites on the London Marathon start. And I'd had a really, really good training block running up to the London Marathon, where for the first time in my life I'd followed quite a strict program, which I hadn't done before. And I'd gotten quite obsessed with the stats and figures, but it got me a result. I ran a fantastic marathon. I felt great. And I felt like I was on top of the world, and I felt like I was completely invincible. And then exactly 2 weeks later, in 2016, it all started to go wrong. And I think that's because I didn't give myself any rest after the marathon. And that fantastic high that I felt, where I really did think I'd cracked this running thing, and I knew exactly what I was doing, and all I needed to do was more and more of what I had been doing before. And then 2 weeks later, I had been invited to start on the elite start in a big race. And I hadn't been feeling great. I'd been feeling a little bit of a niggle in my foot, but I thought, I'll just push through anyway. And 8 kilometers into the race, I actually fell to the floor where a ligament had pinged off the top of my foot, and it was a really nasty injury. And that was the start of a year a year to this weekend as we're speaking now, a cycle of injury which I haven't been able to pull myself out of.
Okay. And I'm going to come back to that because it's something I want to chat about. But there was an article that you'd written, and in it you said, awareness of my body and its defects came early. And I would really like you to speak to that and just explain a little bit about what those defects were or are and how this then played out when you were younger in terms of what you did to try and address this, whether that be through food or through exercise.
Yes, that is true. And it's something that when I'm being introspective, it's something that I'm becoming more and more aware of. And I think about my childhood. I was one of those children who was always trying to be the best she could be.
Okay.
And a lot of that came through taking part in sport, taking part in activities, in ballet and horse riding, all the sort of things that a normal middle-class little girl will do. But I do have these funny little memories where suddenly you're drawn back to your body. And I remember being in a ballet class and being told to suck my stomach in. And we had to wear these little pink belts around our waists. And I remember being very aware of the feel of the belt around my stomach. I couldn't have been more than about 7 or 8 years old, probably even younger than that. And then I remember vividly being with my grandparents one summer, and my grandfather used to love to buy me an ice cream cone. And I remember refusing the ice cream cone because I had realized suddenly that ice cream meant fatness, or eating ice cream meant that I would put on weight. And I don't really know how or what had brought me to this conclusion, but it was a very, very vivid thought. And refusing the ice cream at that age, probably 10 years old, actually felt better to me than eating the ice cream. And that's a cycle that has stayed with me for most of my life. And I can pinpoint that feeling to that moment where I refused the ice cream that my grandfather wanted to buy me, and I felt better about it.
And so is that then continued on throughout? And just going back to something you'd said where you started running after the divorce, did the food stuff get worse at that point?
The food stuff has been on and off for most of my life, certainly. But it's never been terrible. It's always been low level, just not being normal around food. I definitely had some moments, particularly in the worst times of my marriage breakup, when I suppose I could put it, I don't want to minimize it, but I dabbled in bulimic behavior for sure.
Okay.
But I backed away from that very quickly because I realized that it was a black hole that I simply was not willing to go down. However, I would say that the exercise for me became almost a type of bulimia.
Yeah.
And it did become a way for me to purge the calories that I thought I was ingesting. And the fitter I got, the more compulsive that behavior became. Because the fitter you get, the more you feel like you need to push your body, the more you want to feel those endorphins. And for me, a lot of that was caught up in the same feeling I had when I refused that ice cream when I was 10 years old. You feel good about yourself for that moment in time because you've refused something that other people would accept, for example, being the ice cream, or because you've pushed your body harder than maybe other people would be willing to go, for example, running further or faster or harder than everybody else around you. And I think that those two things are very, very much connected in my head. And that's one of the things that caused the problems that I found myself in.
So then to give people a bit of an understanding of how much exercise you were doing, are you able to describe what an average week's worth of training would look like? And I know you've been injured for a while, and so that may have changed things, but when things were going well, so maybe leading up to that marathon that you did well at in London, what was your training looking like at that stage?
Sure. Well, I was following quite a strict marathon training regime up to that point. I was running an average of about 80 miles a week. That would be running 6 days a week, with at least 3 of those would have been double days where I would run twice a day. one long run a week of over 20 miles, so 20 miles plus for a long run. And as well as all of that, I would also cycle probably 4 or 5 times a week on top of what I was doing. I was also riding horses, and I would do weight training in the gym probably once or twice a week as well. So my rest day, in inverted commas, would be quite a heavy weight training day. And I thought that I was doing the right thing. That's what I thought I really needed to do. Oh, and I would go to yoga classes as well. So it was, I have never really totted up all the hours. I know the amount of hours I spent running alone. So I'd be running probably around 10 to 12 hours a week of pure running. But the other activities on top of that, I mean, I really don't know what it would add up to per week, but it was an awful lot of pretty intense activity.
Okay. And I know you already started mentioning about the injury that you got where you had to retire from a race, and I think it was from pretty much 2016 or early 2016 that you have had this procession of injuries. Are you able to give maybe a little bit of a cliff notes of these injuries and how that has happened?
Oh, yes. Well, the first injury was a ligament. Essentially, a ligament tore off the top of my foot, one of the metatarsal bone ligaments that makes your foot bend. The ligament just came away from the bone. So that was nasty and really quite painful, although it healed relatively quickly. And I was back running probably within about, a month and a half after that injury. I have to say I cycled like a demon when I was injured because I could cycle without pain. So I got straight on my road bike and I started doing 100-kilometer races. I did some sportives. I was on the turbo trainer. I really focused on cycling because I felt like I needed that outlet. So within about a month and a half of that injury, I was back running again. I felt good. I actually won a race. Only about 3 weeks after I started running again, I won a long trail race in the Peak District. And I was ramping up again because I was supposed to do a 50-kilometer race in the summer. And then I started getting a niggle in my shin. And that turned into what they thought initially was a stress fracture in my tibia. It turned out not to be a stress fracture, but it was a bad tear of the anterior tibialis, which could have turned into a stress fracture. So I was warned in no uncertain terms, you must stop running. So that set me out again. I was out for a while, cross-trained like a demon again, came back to running, got fit very quickly. I won another race. And then the day after that race, I started feeling a niggle in my quad. And that put me out for a good 2 months. It had been misdiagnosed as a quad tear. It wasn't. It turned out to be something in my TFL. But that was the one that really put me out for the longest. I could barely walk. I was hobbling around. I almost needed crutches. And luckily, I found a fantastic physiotherapist who managed to help me with that and got me through it. And that brings us to Christmas time 2016, and I started my London Marathon training for 2017 for my championship start. And I had about 2 months of solid training, what I would consider solid training, again, ramping it up to around 80 miles a week. And everything felt like it was going all right. And then it wasn't. And that's when I fell into the hole of overtraining symptoms, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But that was more than just a specific injury, although there was specific injury as well, physical injury. I had a whole gamut of various different symptoms, which culminated in me simply not being able to run at all.
Okay. And do you want to, now talk about what those other symptoms are? Because obviously we've talked about the injury side of things, but how was this affecting you day to day and other symptoms?
Sure. Well, it just started to creep up on me quite slowly, where I started not feeling great on runs. I remember I noticed my heart rate was quite high. So my resting heart rate was high. As a very fit person, normally my resting heart rate is normally very, very low. And I noticed that it just was higher than normal. I'd start out on a run and my heart rate would spike up. And I just didn't feel very good. And I'd have to stop quite a bit, which I don't usually have to do. So I just, as many runners do, I pushed through. And then I had runs where I just felt awful. And I remember almost stopping to cry at one point because my legs weren't turning over. I had general aches and pains down my legs, which I got quite often, almost like tired pains where your lower legs just ache as you're running. Then my feet started to go numb, which was quite an alarming symptom. I ran a half marathon in February, and for most of the race, or at least 10 miles of the race, my feet were completely numb. And nobody could explain to me why this would happen. And then I just started I was very tired all the time. But when you're training, you expect it. You expect to be tired all the time. So it doesn't really come as a surprise. But that tiredness just started to creep over everything. So I would know, for example, on a Thursday, I would only ever do one run in the morning. So Thursday afternoon was a rest time for me. And by about 3 o'clock, because my body knew it wasn't going to have to go out for another run, I just remember being so completely exhausted. I could barely bring myself even to get home, to drag myself into bed, because I was so shattered all the time. And then on a Friday, I'd get up and I normally would have done my long run on a Friday, and I would go out and I would do my long run, and it would feel all right. And for a few hours after the run, I'd feel okay. And then the exhaustion would come back again and the aches and pains would come back again. So I was still forcing myself through these runs and I was forcing myself to adhere to the schedule. But I was increasingly getting miserable. I felt sick. My legs ached. And most interestingly, I was simply getting slower. So I was putting all this training in and I wasn't getting any quicker. I wasn't able to hit the splits I was supposed to hit when I did my track sessions. I was much slower when I raced, and I was just getting frustrated, and I couldn't see a way out.
And is this, I mean, obviously at this stage you've realised that there was a problem of you doing so much training. Is this a fairly recent discovery and something you've maybe just been grappling with over the last couple of months, or has this been in the background for quite a while, but you were just trying to ignore it?
That's a really good question. I suppose it's always something I've asked myself, but there's such a fine line between overreaching, which is what all athletes want to do, because in order to progress your training, you have to put some stress on your body, which then adapts to that stress. And that's how fitness works, as I know you've spoken about in previous podcasts. There's such a fine line between that and then actually putting the stress on your body, which you can't recover from. And I think in the past, while I'd walked that line, I hadn't actually ever overstepped it in the same way. And this time I really did overstep the line. And one thing I haven't talked about is the nutrition side of things. And that, I think, more than the actual training load that I was putting on myself, it was the nutrition that sealed the deal in terms of the overtraining problems.
Okay, so do you want to just elaborate on that and maybe talk about the kind of nutritional advice that runners, or maybe not runners because you can't generalize, but maybe what you had been suggested you should be eating to either speed up recovery or to be able to bring your running times down?
It's such a minefield, I think, out there.
Yep.
There's so much advice available online. So many so-called experts out there to tell you what you should and shouldn't be eating. I think as an athlete, especially an athlete like I am, where I'm not world class, I'm not going to be going to the Olympics in any shape or form, but I'm just trying to be as good as I can be, and I'm borderline. So a few really good results could have put me into another league altogether, and I was always trying to just find those things that would help me take that next step up. And so I started looking at my nutrition and wondering what I could change. And I was reading a lot online, and there's a lot out there, particularly in ultra running circles, about being fat adapted and not running on carbohydrates. And I read quite a lot of that, and I thought it made sense. So I did start cutting down my carbohydrates. And I simply got into a cycle of restriction, not actual calorie restriction, but definitely carbohydrate restriction. And I never really made the connection between the way I was feeling and the aches and pains I was getting in my legs, for example, and the fact that I probably was glycogen depleted almost every day. And looking back on it now, it makes me feel really quite silly that I didn't make this distinction for this connection. But when you're surrounded by so much conflicting advice, it's quite difficult to filter through what is worth following and what isn't. And there's so much advice out there which is aimed at the non-athletic population. So there's so much weight loss chatter around online that the normal kind of discourse about eating and nutrition, I think, is very much focused on these questions of losing weight, because I guess the majority of people out there aren't athletes, and quite a lot of those people are overweight and want to lose weight. And so what you read online is so focused on weight loss that it just becomes normalized. So what I was reading was normalized towards people who need to lose weight. And I didn't need to lose weight. What I needed to do was to fuel my body to achieve my athletic ambitions. And I wasn't doing that.
And with you talked about weight loss there. Did you notice as part of this overtraining that your weight was coming down, or actually it wasn't, or even going up?
Well, that's where it gets so interesting. My weight was probably going up. I mean, I don't know whether I actually was gaining weight, but I did notice things were getting a little bit tighter. I was a bit puffy, which was quite interesting because I don't usually sort of have problems like that. So I noticed that I ride horses. I have made-to-measure riding boots, and I noticed that they were very, very tight around my calves where they hadn't been before. And my face looked puffy. So even though in my mind I was eating as healthily and as cleanly as I could, I certainly wasn't losing weight, and my body composition was certainly not improving in any way.
Yeah. And what I find is interesting when I'm listening to you talk about this stuff and your story is that, yes, you were taking this to another level in terms of your amount of training was a much higher than the majority of people are doing. And you were probably focusing on your diet with a little more precision or vengeance or whatever it may be than most people are doing. But really what you were describing is what I see with so many of my clients across the board, whether that's someone who's going to the gym 3 days a week and they're underfueling for what they need, or someone like yourself who is doing an inordinate amount of training but is still underfueling for what their body needs and definitely underresting for what it needs.
Well, I think that we're so surrounded by this discourse of dieting that and especially as a woman, for whatever reason, it's very, very hard to disassociate ourselves from it. So, for example, I remember after I ran the London Marathon last year, I went out for dinner with my partner to celebrate, and I sat there feeling guilty about the food I was eating, despite the fact that I had just run a marathon. It's so difficult to get that mindset out of your head when everyone around you and everything you read and on Facebook and on Instagram is so focused in on these discussions of restriction and calorie restriction and carbohydrate restriction, and this food makes you fat and that food doesn't make you fat. And so to actually take yourself out of that discourse is a really, really difficult thing to do. And it's something I see even among the athletes I'm friends with. We love to talk about food. I mean, I think everybody does. But our discussions around food always focus in on what food what food's going to fuel us, what food's going to make us faster, but also what can we eat that's not going to make us fat, but is going to make us quick. And there is still that focus on good foods and bad foods, and should we eat this chia seed energy ball or should we eat this Mars bar? When you're burning so many thousands of calories every day in your basic training, and you're not putting those calories back in, and you're becoming weaker and slower and more miserable, I think it does things to your mind as well. And I think it becomes very difficult to start to see clearly what's going on around you, because you're in a bit of a haze of malnutrition almost. And I think that might sound a little bit melodramatic, but I genuinely think that there are a lot of people like me out there who while we think that we are taking in all the new nutrients we need, and we study nutrition and we track our macronutrients to some degree, we're actually just not nourished.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And it's amazing with working with clients, seeing the improvement just by having them eat more food and doing that on a consistent basis and eating more regularly, and how that changes their mood and emotion. Where I know a lot of the time it's like, oh, you've got to have a better mindset, or it's about reframing the problem, or you just need to look at it in a different light. And it's like, no, you just need to eat more food. And it's amazing how much of those emotional issues just start to drift away once people are then fed the amount of food that they really need. And there was a quote when you were emailing me, one of the things you said was, I could no more eat a pastry in a cafe with my friends than fly to the moon, which I think is probably a quite good description of how much this food stuff was really having an impact on you.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I couldn't, and I still couldn't. I can't lie to myself and say that this is all in the past, because it's absolutely not. I'm making a conscious effort to be better about these things at the moment, and I am making improvements, but I'm still very much caught in this mindset. I was out with some friends last weekend, visiting some friends in France, and we went to a pizza restaurant. I just couldn't order the pizza. I simply couldn't. I had a salad. I could not order the pizza. I didn't particularly want the pizza, but even if I had wanted the pizza, I couldn't have ordered the pizza. So that shows how far I still have to go in this process. And I would like to be in a position at some point in the future where I can be more relaxed about these things. And I don't really know when that will be, but hopefully it will be at some point. And I'm starting to realize that it's not just the food. I've got to take the food and the exercise together, because I probably would have eaten the pizza if I had been running, but I wasn't running because I'm still injured. And so in my mind, I don't deserve the pizza. And breaking through that mentality and breaking through that way of thinking is the only way I know that I'll ever be able to run again. And running is a great gift. For me anyway, running is the greatest gift in my life. I love it. It is the thing that makes me happiest in the world. And so that's what makes me want to break through this destructive mindset that I found myself in order to re-find the thing that has made me so happy in the past.
And so I want to now chat about the idea of exercise addiction or exercise compulsion, because I know you're having some time off at the moment, but I'd love for you to speak about how you think about or you relate to those terms from your own personal experience with exercise.
Sure. It's a tricky one, because is it a real addiction? I don't really know. I mean, I know that it is possible to be addicted to non-substances, and there's such a thing as gambling addiction, for example. And maybe it's something similar to that. Certainly you become, you enjoy the way you feel so much when you achieve a certain feeling you get when you exercise. They call it the runner's high or the endorphins. And I think some of it is certainly wanting to feel that more often, because quite frankly, it feels nice. And there are few things that make you feel as good as that unless you take substances, which is an addiction in itself. So yes, you certainly want to go and get more of that. I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, of course, in my mind. A lot of it is to do with self-image. So if you've built up an idea of yourself as an athlete, then you've invested a lot into creating that image of yourself, both in your own mind and for other people. So you want to sustain that, and you realize that you get a certain amount of adulation for being an athlete, for being the person who runs the furthest or runs the fastest. And that becomes addictive in itself, because that's your self-worth. Your self-worth is completely bound up in the fact that other people perceive you in this particular way. You are the athletic one.
Yeah.
You are the person who people look at and say, oh, look at you. You look great. Look at that wonderful body. Look at your abs. You've got a flat stomach. You've got great legs, and all of that is. And you hear these people say these things, and you realize, well, I only have this because I do all the activities that I do. And if I dare drop any of it, if I dare dial back any of those activities, I will lose these things that make other people appreciate me. And I think that is a very, very strong part of it. And then you have the exercise bulimia side of things, which I think is also another really important part, where you just simply make an equation. I've eaten this, therefore I must work it off. I've eaten this number of calories, therefore I must burn this number of calories. And even if it's not as conscious as that, because I've never really calorie counted, I have no idea how many calories I eat in a day, but I do know that I can make these equations in my head. Oh, I had that extra whatever for dinner, therefore tomorrow I better run a little bit harder, or do an extra weight session, or maybe go a little bit further on my bike than I was planning to go. You make these little pacts with yourself. And I think because you're constantly hungry as well, and you do want to eat more. So I'll have breakfast and I'll still feel a little bit hungry. So I'll have that sort of extra handful of nuts, which is what I considered a treat. Just that extra handful of raw cashew nuts. And then I'll think, oh, I better just do an extra few miles just to offset those cashew nuts. And it feels extremely rational because you're doing it for a reason. You feel like, well, it's rational because I'm doing it because I need to achieve this body composition, which is the thing that other people value about me. And I really think that that's what it comes down to. You've learnt, it becomes a self-perpetuating circle. You've learnt that other people value you for the way you look because you've put all this work into creating a body that looks like the way you do. So you don't dare lose that body or do anything that might jeopardize that body, because you might then be jeopardizing the admiration that you're getting from other people. And I think that's the cycle that one gets into when one is suffering from these things.
And especially when the suffering from those things means that everything else falls away, where all you have is your exercise. And so that then becomes your identity as you described. And so it's like, well, if I don't have that, I don't have a whole lot of other things that people think that I'm really good at or that I think I'm really good at. So there is no kind of fallback.
Oh, absolutely. You become a very, very boring person, I'm sure. All you think about is when you're going to be able to do your exercise. So holidays revolve around exercising. Visiting friends revolve around, oh, I better get my run in at 5 o'clock that morning because I have to leave the house at 8 to go visit my friends or family. And yes, it becomes... Well, I think, first of all, you don't have enough energy to think about anything else. And secondly, that is simply just what starts to consume you. And it's very easy to justify it because unlike other addictions like drugs or smoking or alcohol, it's something that's admired in the general population.
Totally.
So I constantly hear people say, and they mean the best by it, I know they do, oh, you're so athletic. look at how quick you are, look how far you run. Oh, I could never do what you do. Oh, you're going for a run again. I couldn't do that. And these comments, while they're incredibly well-meaning, they just serve to underline the compulsion.
Yeah. And I mean, you said something earlier in regards to addiction. And I think the word addiction has been thrown around a lot, especially in regards to people talking about sugar addiction. And I think the word has lost a little of its meaning. But I really subscribe. There's a guy called Dr. Gabor Mate, and I really subscribe to his definition of addiction, which is any repeated behavior, substance-related or not, in which a person feels compelled to persist regardless of its negative impact on his or her life or the lives of others. And so I definitely, from hearing your story and everything you're talking about, it's continuing to exercise despite the fact that you're injured, or continuing to exercise despite the fact that you're so tired, or you've got all of these other negative ramifications. But even knowing that information, there's that compulsion or an inability to really stop.
Absolutely. And when I think of myself, I have an image of myself running down the road, I had hardly been able to walk, but I was forcing myself to run with pain shooting up my leg with a suspected stress fracture. And yet it was the only thing I knew how to do. I just had to run. The pain didn't matter at that point. All that mattered was that I was doing the run. And I didn't even care if I was giving myself a stress fracture. I didn't care so long as I did that run. And that's how deeply ingrained that compulsion can be.
Yeah. And again, I think maybe you've taken it a little further than other people, but there are a lot of clients who would still fall into that same category. And maybe they're not thinking, oh, okay, if I give myself a stress fracture, it doesn't matter because I need to get this run done. But there's a lot of people who are recognizing that exercise is a problem within their life, but despite that recognition, they're still keeping it up.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I know you work with other athletes, so people come and you help them in terms of training. Are you able to describe the kind of person who comes to train with you, so what level they're at, what they're hoping to get out of it?
I think there's a large number of people who are what I would call ambitious club runners. So people who've picked up the sport normally later in life. They feel like they're enjoying it. It's been a fun thing for them to do, and they want to get a little bit quicker. Maybe they want to start doing longer races. And in the past, I would have been very keen on setting up quite strict training programs. I've done a lot of training programs for various people for them to follow, to do their first marathon or do a quicker half marathon, that sort of thing. It's quite interesting, though, in recent months, I'm starting to think very differently about how I help people in their training, and to put a lot more focus on having fun and being flexible in their training in a way that I never would have done before. And it's something that I've learned from my own experience, that if you're going to succeed in this sport, particularly as an older athlete, you've got to maintain the sense of fun that should be at the core of your training. And if you become a slave to the training plan, where every single day just becomes a tick box, tick it off, I've done that session, move on to the next one, you're going to lose that joy, which is the thing that got you moving in the first place. And I think I see a lot of these people who start in the sport through things like Couch to 5K, which I think is brilliant. People who are finally learning how to actually move their bodies in a positive way, which is fantastic. And I really don't want to come across as being negative about exercise, because I'm not. Exercise, movement, being outside in the open air, enjoying the things that your body can do is absolutely vital in my mind to being a human being.
Yeah, agreed.
What I want to try and help people to do is to both achieve their aims in sport as far as possible, but to do it in a way that sustains that sense of joy and movement.
And when you're chatting about that type of thinking with these people who are coming to see you? How receptive are people to that message? Is everyone on board, or you win some, you lose some?
Oh, no. People are very black and white. And I think unless you've had an experience like I have, it can take, you have to learn, I think, to understand what I'm saying. Some people are quite receptive to it. And it's interesting. I think the people who are most receptive are the people who've come to it through other sports, particularly team sports, actually. So if you've come from a background where you've played a lot of team sports, you've played maybe football or cricket or rugby, I think there seems to be a lot more of an emphasis on the having fun side of things. Whereas if you've come from sports where it's been a much more personal thing, like running is, it seems to attract the sort of person who has that very driven personality. And these are the people who, sadly, I think, do sometimes fall into the trap that I fell into. And I'm very much a case in point. I mean, if somebody had tried to talk to me last year about this, I wouldn't have been receptive to it either. So it is very, very difficult, I think, to prevent this from happening before it does. But I think it is possible, and by talking about it, because this isn't something that's much talked about. And again, we talk about social media and the articles that are out there about food. If you scroll through a typical runner's social media feed who subscribes to all the usual runner-type sites, most of them will be about doing more, pushing harder, different types of training, different types of regimes. Should you do this? Should you do that? Should you do this tempo run? How many miles a week should you be running? How quick should you be running? What should be your next half marathon training goal?
Yeah.
And there's very little out there about enjoying your running to feel, learning how to actually listen to your body. And that's one of the reasons why I was so keen to talk about this, because I really think if I had heard somebody talking on a podcast like yours that I respect, then maybe I would have sat up and listened a little bit more.
And I mean, I know you said that it's not talked about very much. It's probably a bit more taboo. Are there places where this is being talked about? Like, I imagine you're part of different Facebook groups or forums or even meetup groups in real life all around running. Are people starting to chat about this, or it's still not very much confronted?
Not in the mainstream, but there certainly are. And I think it's becoming more and more popular as a discussion topic, because there have been a few high-profile runners who've come out recently and talked about their own issues. I mean, I know that there's been there's a very well-known British runner called Tina Muir who has spoken recently about her problems around amenorrhea to do with her running. And when people like that, who are quite high-profile in the social media world, get a platform and are able to open up the conversation, to some degree it opens the floodgates. And I've had people recently say to me, oh, I read this and it rang a bell with me, and maybe it's made me think a little bit more about the way I do my training. But what I really think we need to do is actually to look very hard at the training messages that we are giving to amateur athletes. So, for example, I have a very close friend who's done quite a bit of training in Kenya, where the best athletes in the world, the best runners in the world come from. And in Kenya, if you're on a training camp in Kenya, you're running pretty much to feel most of the time. They might do one or two proper sessions, as we would consider sessions, so a track session or a speed session. But nearly all their other runs are done without a watch, to feel, with a group, conversationally. And it's very different from the way we run here. And if you don't feel well, you stay at home and eat dinner instead. And we need to change our culture, I think, of it being all or nothing. I must do this run because it says so on the plan. The plan should say, maybe you can do a tempo run today if you feel like it. But if you're really not feeling it, then maybe you should just back off a little bit, leave your watch at home, go for a jog. Or if you still don't feel like it, well, maybe you should just go for a walk with a dog instead.
Yeah. And how, I know this is going to be your opinion, but how much or how prevalent or how common do you think it is for people to be overtraining and undereating in the level that you're at? And I mean, you can also answer it at basically whatever levels that you are in contact with, and you can speak to. Like, how common do you think this is?
I think it's worryingly common. I look around at the front of local races. I go to a lot of local races. I don't run them so much anymore because I'm frankly not very good at the shorter distances, but my partner does, and I go and watch and marshal quite a bit. And I think when I see the number of very, very good, talented runners who are winning or being placed at local races, and I see how often these people are recycled. So they run, they have a fantastic season, they get quicker and quicker, and then they disappear. And they're not disappearing because they've got interested in something else. They're disappearing because they've got badly injured, and they've run themselves into a bit of a hole. And I've seen this time and time again with talented runners who have a breakthrough season and then they just disappear off the face of the earth. And there are some who are more resilient. And I think the ones who are more resilient are probably the ones who have got the nutrition right and haven't got sucked in to nutrition fads or undereating. But when you look around you at the start line at the front of a local race, and you see the body composition of the people who are doing well, it's hard not to raise your eyebrows, particularly the women, but the men as well, definitely the men as well. When you see very, very thin, very under-muscled people who look fragile, and they're fast, my goodness, they're fast. Of course they're fast because they've got quite low body weight, but they are not at all resilient. And it's quite sad to see these talented runners just disappear for months and years at a time because of injuries and stress fractures and tendon and ligament injuries, broken bones. And it just becomes normalized. And it worries me because I see that it's normalized. And I see people who run a fantastic cross-country season through the winter, which is quite tough. They're running week after week and they're at the front of these races. And then, bang, they're straight into marathon training on the 1st of January. And then they get injured and they're out for a whole year. And they wonder why. And you think, well, maybe just rest and recovery isn't being prioritized here. And there's such a pressure on people to be thinner and faster because thin equals fast in the minds of a lot of runners. And you want to look like everybody else looks like on the start line. So if everyone around you who's running at your level is whippet thin, well, you're going to want to be whippet thin as well.
Do you think that you can be an elite distance runner and be healthy, or are these two things just incompatible?
Oh, definitely. And there are plenty out there who are.
Okay.
For example, I think most of the Kenyan runners, putting aside the doping issue, which is a whole different kettle of fish, but imagining for 1 second that all these elite runners are actually clean, which I hope they are, I think most of the East African runners have achieved a very, very healthy lifestyle with their training and running, where they're eating sufficiently and correctly for the amount of training they're doing, and they're running to feel, and that's why they are the best in the world. I think there's a really toxic culture, particularly coming out of American collegiate and high school running, which has leaked to some degree into some of the top British clubs, for especially around the sort of younger, early mid-20s women who are doing a lot of distance running at the moment. And I think that the culture that's coming out of there is probably not sustainable. Jumping over that a little bit into ultra running, a lot of older people take up ultra running, so predominantly kind of 40 plus. People tend to peak in ultra running in their 40s. And it should be, and it often is, quite a healthy form of running because it's quite low intensity. So yes, you're going longer, but you're going slower. So it's, in general, it's actually easier on your body than, say, marathon running, hardcore marathon running. But I sadly start seeing this mentality is leaching in to the culture of ultra running as well now, which is really sad because I think for years ultra running was a bit of a a bit of an oasis away from this. But as it becomes more high profile and there becomes more sponsorship available to runners and more press coverage of these races, then yes, I do sadly think that this is becoming an issue in that sport as well.
And you mentioned the Kenyans and then I think East Asians, and you put it down to them having better eating or better life balance or whatever the phrase was. Do you think there is a genetic component to this as well, that they are just built to be runners? And I haven't looked into this myself. I mean, you get that impression often when you're watching the Olympics, but I don't know if there's any credence to that.
Oh, without a doubt, there are people who are genetically predisposed to be better as distance runners. People who have naturally higher VO2 max, people who can process more oxygen, people who've been born and raised at altitude. But that when we come down a level, I think once you are not actually in contention for an Olympic medal,
yeah,
that genetic edge is probably not quite as important because it is so marginal. But also I think that when you come down to that next rung just below, that's where people are becoming so obsessed about achieving absolutely everything they possibly can out of a body which may not actually be able to produce those goals. Because if your body isn't the same, say, as somebody who's been born and raised at altitude in Iten in Kenya, and you've been born in London at sea level, then it is going to be harder for you, and you are going to have to put more pressure on your body. And unless you are a genetic outlier, like, say, a Paula Radcliffe was, you simply are always going to have to put more pressure on yourself. And that might not be feasible.
So, Charlotte, one final question before I wrap this up. Is there any advice that you would want to give to someone who identifies with your story and what we've been chatting about today? And it doesn't have to be an athlete. It doesn't even have to be someone who's into running per se, but just someone who finds themselves struggling with an inability to cut down or cease their exercise despite negative side effects.
I think my best advice would be to take a step back, really look at yourself and what you're doing as though you were from the outside. So imagine you were your own friend, your best friend or your partner or your mother, and look at yourself doing what you're doing and imagine what they would say to you, and then take that on board. And the second thing I would say is think about what you love. Think about what you love about the exercise you're doing. Not the negative things like I'm doing it because I feel I have to or I need to burn off these calories. But think about why you did it in the first place. You love to move your body. You love to be outside. Maybe you love the feeling of moving through the countryside like a lot of runners or cyclists might. And take that thing and try and remove that from the negativity and the self-doubt that has surrounded it. So try to rediscover the kernel in the exercise program that you've got, which is the thing that actually makes you happy. So I'm not saying that people should stop exercising or stop being athletic. Far from it. I just think that if it's possible to rediscover the actual pleasure and joy in that thing that they're doing, hopefully it will negate the pathological side where exercise has become a compulsion.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed this conversation. If people want to find out more about you or connect with you through your website or social media, where should they be going? And I'm going to put everything in the show notes, but you can just tell the listeners.
Sure. Well, I have a blog. It's called Impossible Highway. So you'll find me at impossiblehighway.wordpress.com. And I do try and write on that. I've slacked off a little bit recently, mainly because I've been injured, and writing about being injured is very boring. But I'm going to try and write a lot more on there, especially after having this conversation with you. And I can be found on Instagram. I'm Lottie78 on Instagram, but you can also find me by just searching for my name. And I put on a lot of photographs, mainly to do with running, but also nice places. And I live in a beautiful part of the countryside, so hopefully it will encourage people to get out into the countryside. And I'm going to try to be more available online. I'm quite happy to answer people's emails, particularly if they want to get in touch with me about this. So I'll be quite happy. I'll give you my email address in the show notes. So if people want to email me directly, I would be more than happy to get in touch with them so we can talk about things that we've been talking about today.
Cool. Thank you. And so, thank you again for coming on the show. I know, as you said, that this is still a work in progress and stuff you're still dealing with, but I really found this conversation helpful, and I know the listeners are going to find the same thing.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.